How's it going, you guys? So in this video, I wanted to talk about the urinary system a little bit, mainly because I've seen a lot of AP questions at this point, past AP questions or AP questions on the AP question test bank that I pull from. I've seen a lot of questions that use ADH, antidiuretic hormone, as an example of a feedback mechanism, as an example of osmoregulation. So ultimately I wanted to talk a little bit about that so you're familiar with how ADH works, and to understand ADH, you first have to understand the urinary system. So as you can see, I have a human diagram in standard anatomical positions, so hands are at the side. If any of you guys take anatomy, you'll appreciate that, as well as the kidneys. Kidneys are located in a person's abdominal cavity, and they're kind of towards the back of the abdominal cavity, almost embedded in the back wall. And the kidneys filter out any metabolic waste from your bloodstream and put it into urine, sometimes concentrated urine. That will go down the ureter into the bladder, and eventually your body gets rid of it. It excretes it. So this whole process is done through the work of the kidney, the filtration process. So here I have a kidney. I'll see if I can bring it up a little bit closer so you can see the details there. Oh, that's a little bit too close. Right there. So for this kidney that I drew, there are really just two main parts to the kidney that you need to be aware of. One is the renal cortex. It's the outermost part of the kidney. And then if you go a little bit deeper, you have the renal medulla through here. And basically, we're going to talk about how the renal medulla is a little bit saltier in concentration. It has a higher salinity. And the renal cortex is a little less salty. Now, once you filter out the metabolic waste from the bloodstream, it basically goes into this area of the kidney. You don't need to know the names of any of these parts. And it will pass through the ureter, into the bladder, and so on and so forth. So let's zoom in on this junction, this cross section, or the meeting point, between the renal cortex and the renal medulla. So if we zoom in on this area right here, we'll end up seeing something like this. Let me bring this a little bit closer. And that's good. Maybe a little bit back. Okay. A little bit more. All right, that's good. So this right here is a nephron. A nephron. These are the functional and structural units of a kidney. And so this is what's going to really do the filtration process, pulling the metabolic waste and some water out of the bloodstream and allowing that to exit the body as urine. So here we have a nephron located in the kidneys. This right here is this whole thing is a long tubule. Here is the Bowman's capsule, and here is a glomerulus. It's basically this bed of capillaries that you pull liquid out of. And so you're basically pulling out pure blood plasma, right here, and we call that a filtrate. So we pull out a filtrate with everything in it: glucose, salts, water, everything that's in blood plasma is going to be pulled out. Now, a lot of that stuff gets pulled back in, glucose especially, amino acids especially. They get pulled out right in the proximal tubule. But this is where I want to focus, on the loop of Henle. So the way a nephron works is the renal medulla, which is where the loop of Henle is located, is very salty. It has a high sodium concentration in particular. So I'll just put salty. And the renal cortex is less salty. So once the liquid or the filtrate passes through down the descending tube, and this right here is called the loop of Henle. I'll put that in there, loop of Henle. Oh, I think it's E. Loop of Henle. So as the filtrate goes down or passes down through the loop of Henle in the first tubule, what happens is water is pulled out by osmosis. So I'll kind of draw some arrows here to show that water, H2O, is being pulled out by the process of osmosis. And that's because the renal medulla gets saltier and saltier as we go down. So there's more solute there, and so therefore the solvent, water, is going to be pulled out. Now, once we get to the bottom of the loop of Henle, that's where the filtrate is at its highest concentration of solute, because a lot of that water was pulled out, and it kind of concentrated the filtrate as it went down. Then, as it goes back up, what happens is sodium is pumped out. Na+, Na+. And what happens is, as we pump sodium out, chlorine soon follows. Or chlorine ions, I should say. So sodium and chlorine ions are being pumped out. So that's where the salt comes from. And so eventually you become a little less concentrated as you get towards the top of the distal tubule. So we pull water out as we're going down by osmosis. We pump sodium and chlorine ions out as we're going back up. We pass through the distal tubule, and then we enter this thing called the collecting duct. This collecting duct is important. So what happens is, once we have our filtrate and we pulled everything out of it, we pulled out our necessary glucose and amino acids here, we got rid of some ions along the way, some potassium ions also leave somewhere in that process. So by the time we enter the collecting duct, we can say that it's almost ready to go leave through the ureter into the bladder and leave the body as urine. But the thing is, we can control how concentrated this urine is going to be based on what happens in the collecting duct. So let's say you are dehydrated, right? You want to keep water inside your system. So you're going to want to reabsorb a lot of that water back into the bloodstream. And I neglected to mention that this whole thing is covered in capillaries, is covered in blood vessels that will help pull that stuff back into the bloodstream. But I just did not draw that in for the sake of clarity. And just, it would get kind of messy up here if I drew in all the blood vessels. But we can reabsorb some of that water if we are dehydrated through the action of ADH, antidiuretic hormone. So ADH. Diuretic refers to water leaving the body. So if you have diarrhea, that means that your feces, your stools, are going to be very liquidy. That means there's a lot of water in your stools. Whereas antidiuretic means that you're going to not lose a lot of water in the process. So we actually want to concentrate the urine using antidiuretic hormone. And the way it works is the ADH targets cells in the collecting duct. If we were to look at a cell in the collecting duct, let's say we zoomed in right here, we might see a square-shaped cell. That ADH is going to come along, it's going to bind to a receptor protein, signaling a transduction pathway. That transduction pathway is going to end in a response, and that response is to insert more aquaporins, or water channels, into the wall, or into the membrane of those cells. So what this will do is it will allow water water to easily pass out and get reabsorbed by the body, by the bloodstream, through osmosis. Because remember, the renal medulla is still very salty. Even though we pulled out water here, we pumped out sodium and chlorine ions here. So because the renal medulla is still very salty, water will naturally want to diffuse out by osmosis towards the area where it's saltier, where there's a higher solute concentration. So we could, using antidiuretic hormone, through cell signaling and through signal transduction pathways, insert more aquaporins into the membranes of these cells. And those aquaporins will allow water to easily escape as the filtrate basically passes through the collecting duct. So I'll say water leaves by osmosis, thus concentrating the urine. If we had too much water in our system, let's say we drank a lot of just distilled water and we didn't have much else to our diet, that means we're overhydrated. So at that point, we wouldn't want ADH. So the body, the pituitary gland in the brain, would stop releasing ADH, which means there wouldn't be aquaporins here in these cells lining the collecting duct, which means water would not naturally diffuse out by osmosis, and our urine would end up being more dilute. So more ADH means more aquaporins, which means more concentrated urine. Less ADH means less aquaporins in the collecting duct, which means basically less concentrated urine, more dilute urine. Interestingly enough, alcohol inhibits ADH, so if someone were to drink alcohol, they would release less ADH, antidiuretic hormone, which means whether they're dehydrated or not, their urine would be more dilute. Also, I guess just to tie things in, this is an example of a negative feedback mechanism. So I'll put negative feedback. Because if you think about it, negative feedback works to maintain a set point, right? So if you tip too far in one direction, then some action will basically bring it back to that set point, like a thermostat, where if your house gets too cold, the thermostat will sense that, it'll heat up the house using the furnace, and it'll come back to that set point. If your house gets too warm, the furnace will be turned off, and it will go back to that set point. So we want to maintain a certain amount of water in our bloodstream at any given moment, because without water, our blood would not work as well, nor would our body. So in this situation, we need to regulate or osmoregulate the amount of water in our body. So if we don't have a lot of water, if we have a lot of salt in our bloodstream, we will release ADH to kind of bring the salt concentration to a more controllable level, bring more water back into the bloodstream. Hopefully that was helpful. I guess as a final little thing that doesn't really matter all that much, I have a model of the brain. So this right here is an enlarged model of the human brain. And if you look underneath this little part right here that kind of hangs underneath the brain is the pituitary gland, and that is our master hormone center. So that will release many hormones such as antidiuretic hormone. So antidiuretic hormones comes from the pituitary gland, and so do several other hormones. But that is it. I don't believe I left anything out. So the long story short is it is useful to know the hormone ADH, because ADH comes up every now and again on AP exams, AP questions. So I figured I'd make this video just so you can review it, and if you have any questions, just let me know.